like to say welcome to the Knowledge Management Education Forum. What we're doing here is we're trying to find common ground with knowledge management and make it a discipline. And what we're trying to do also is to bring together not only academia, but industry and government as well, because you see on both sides of the card, we need to know what we need to offer, and we also need to know what industry needs so that we can get some of these KM initiatives off the ground and executed. Now, the goals of KMEF is basically we are trying to find common ground. Well, I've talked to this one, I'm sorry, to move forward. We're trying to find common ground, which is basically what we agree upon with knowledge management. I think we all can know and say that with knowledge management, there's a lot of different variations going around. And even to the point where some people say we still have to define knowledge and we still have to define knowledge management. Well, Denise and I kind of said, well, we're going to move past that because I don't know that there is one definition, and maybe we just need to resolve that knowledge is the definition that Webster Merriam has within its findings. So we're going to look more toward academia and industry based on what do we need to teach, which are the competencies and the curriculum and the core areas and elements that people need to know to be successful. So we are actually looking for common ground as well to acknowledge it as a professional, as a professional discipline. I think, again, like I said, we can work together to promote it. There are a lot of KM initiatives currently existing in the industry as well as in government. And a lot of times when we come together, we find that we do have some common areas, we find that we do have some variations, but we'd like to come up with something that says we can teach this and then you can apply it. So we can now turn it over to Denise, who's going to talk to you about where we're going to move forward.
I'd like to give you a little bit of an update of what's happening on the webinars, because most of you have been listening in or participating, but you couldn't see everybody else who was participating. So we actually had participants from 21 countries online, including the US, Canada, Germany, Singapore, UK, Ukraine, India, Australia, Switzerland, France, Russia, Netherlands, Hong Kong, China, Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Ireland. So I think if you have any doubts that KM is international and global, you know, just this very short-term effort surfaced a lot of folks. The webinar archives have been accessed 2,600 times in just the last few weeks, so that's not a bad start. The lowest number of weekly visits to the wiki was 227 each week, and it accumulates. And the highest number for any one week was 526. There's a lot of interest out there. We want to keep this going. So we'd like to ask each of the panelists to speak to two questions. The first question for this group is, based on your experiences, research, and perceptions, what are your thoughts about strategic roles and responsibilities of knowledge professionals and organizations today?
Topic fairly brief. I come at this from a business perspective. I consult to the government. I am responsible for the revenue share of a corporation, and that's largely what I've been doing for the last 10 or 12 years. So in that context, when I work with government clients, I try to focus my discussion points around two critical areas for knowledge management. The first of those is the use of technology. That's not a surprise, I think, to anybody in this room. But more specifically, how do we want to use technology? There are basic aspects to this around collaborative applications, collaborative environments, technologies for collaboration, for information sharing, for document sharing, and so forth. These are I think, fairly well known by most of the members of this audience. Decision support systems are a critical piece. We're trying to digitize much of the information, create rules-based decision-making, take some of the more mundane analysis out of day-to-day work by installing that, integrating that into the application level of where work is done, and make that easier in what we call rules-based technology. I do want to say one thing about decision-making, and I hope it'll come up later in the discussion because it merits more than what I'm going to say about it here. And I'll address that actually with regard to the next item on my list. But the third and most important component around technology for me is actually something that I saw reflected in one of the webinars. I think it was in David's actually, where he referred to creating a knowledge architecture. I think that's critically important, but I think it has more to do than just the traditional discipline of knowledge management. It literally goes to an area that I'm working a great deal in today, and that's the creation of networks for network optimization, and doing it specifically in healthcare, and more specifically in the military health services. That's my current work. But much like the national health reform, where we're looking at the underlying architecture that is supporting much of what we're trying to do in information sharing, I think we need to be thinking in the context of knowledge architecture. And I have some stories that we may get to later, but the main thrust of the point is, it's not just about optimizing networks, it's not just about optimizing information flow, it's literally using the network, both inside an organization and outside, to create a knowledge architecture that facilitates much more than information flow, but really knowledge creation. That's the first point. The second point is the economics of knowledge. And here I would say there are three critical points. If you're in the business world, and I know we get to this in a later discussion as well, you have to be able to justify, somebody said it earlier, the investment that Ohio has made. I could identify a number of other states who've made significant investments, and I'll state, for the most part, largely in the discussion around healthcare, we know what's going on in the national healthcare debate. There's a lot of hope being placed in technology. I would argue that unless we're thinking about how technology facilitates knowledge creation, both for decision-making purposes, for problem resolution, for optimization of the spend in healthcare, we won't achieve anything other than implementing a lot of technology. So the three pieces on the economics of knowledge. The first would be decision-making. Decision-making is both the objective that comes as a result of a sufficient amount of information necessary to make intelligent decisions in a dynamic way as well as in a strategic way. The second, and I think frankly more important issue on decision-making, is what Gladwell talks about in his book Blink, that real strategic decision makers in organizations don't go to a strategic plan every day. They don't access 3 databases to figure out how to make a decision. They make it largely on instinct, but the instinct was educated through a process of knowledge management that they've engaged in either throughout the course of their career or in many cases throughout their entire life. The best example of this would be Napoleon, who everybody thought was the greatest military strategist of his time, and many thereafter. And people think Napoleon was able to just access information and get things from his vantage point on the battlefield and make decisions better because of that. The fact of the matter is, Napoleon was schooled in decision-making early on in his career through a wealth of information and knowledge that he had acquired that gave him mental models, images that we're all familiar with, that allowed him to see patterns across the battlefield and make decisions more quickly. The economics of information and of knowledge has to take decision-making into account, both objective and long-term. Second, I think, is innovation. No surprise here. Knowledge management must lead to the advantage of innovation. The only advantage that most corporations have, less so for government agencies, but profit-based corporations, the only advantage they have is their ability to continuously innovate. And knowledge management must contribute to that as an economic component. The third, and I think critically important in the era that we live, is what I call adaptability. Knowledge management in the universal framework that you all discussed in your 4 levels has to contribute to an organization's ability to adapt to its environment. Because, accept it or not, the reality is that the world around us is shifting. And even the mental models that we may be creating are now facing realities that we're not familiar with, and our mental models are failing us in many cases. And so I think knowledge management in an economic framework has to contribute to this universal ability to create adaptability for organizations. For me, technology and economics are the 2 underlying components for knowledge management, positions and value propositions.